Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. The Association for Neighborhood Housing Development, ANHD, recently analyzed storefront rents in New York City and found they've risen by an average of 10% in the past year. Ironically, lower Manhattan storefront rents have decreased, while in the outer boroughs, of course, including the Bronx, they've gone up. The implications of this trend could be ominous. Can small businesses that fuel so much of our local economy survive? Are we in for a new round of gentrification in some of our lower and middle income Bronx neighborhoods? To help us answer those questions and maybe offer some ideas on how to reverse those trends, please join me in welcoming the Senior Research and Data Associate for the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development, ANHD. It is Ms. Lucy Block. Nice to have you with us, Ms. Block.
Thank you so much for having me.
And the Assemblymember from the 79th Assembly District, which includes the Bronx neighborhoods of Concourse Village, Melrose, Morrisania, Claremont, Belmont, and East Tremont. It is the Honorable Chantel Jackson. Nice to have you with us. We should note the Assemblymember is on the Assembly's Committee on Small Businesses. Ms. Block, let's just start with you. You know what? Let's just show the numbers. We have a full page with some of the numbers. And you will see that the increase in median storefront rents in Brooklyn are up 23%, our home borough, the Bronx, 14%, and in Queens, 9%. This is kind of scary stuff, right? And at some point, I want to get into the fact that Manhattan hasn't had this, lower Manhattan hasn't had this problem. Let's just talk about why we think this happened.
Sure. So the years that we analyzed for this data and research was 2019 to 2021, and that changed. 2019 is the earliest that we have, so we've got that pre-pandemic snapshot. And then 2021, we're obviously a couple years into all of it. And so I was definitely really shocked by these numbers as well. You know, we saw this flooding out of Manhattan at the height of the pandemic, especially from wealthier and more affluent neighborhoods. If you all remember, this talk of like New York City is dead during the pandemic was maybe true in business districts in Manhattan, more affluent parts of Manhattan, and very much not the case in other boroughs.
And let's just add, if that's the case, if the buildings down there are empty, that means all the lunch counters and all the delis and all the stores that feed off all the people who are working are not doing well, because we're talking about small businesses.
Sure.
That's a big problem.
Sure. And, you know, there was a lot of talk about how this was happening on the residential side during the height of the pandemic. And you saw these big changes in rents. You had people getting these, you know, unprecedented deals on Manhattan apartments because there was this vacating of a lot of the borough for people who could afford to leave to, you know, a calmer location. And in lots of places outside of Manhattan, we had either, you know, rents staying the same or increasing. And this data shows that that was absolutely happening on the commercial side as well.
So let's just follow what you said. So in Manhattan, you said that even residential rents, people were getting cheap apartments. And then one would think storefront owners were also doing better because landlords wanted to, you know, help them out and fill their businesses. Why didn't that play in the outer boroughs? One would think in the outer boroughs, people were not out. They wanted to make sure this survived, the businesses survived, that people were able to afford rents, but it went up. I don't like it.
Sure. I mean,
It sounds crazy to me.
Well, there were lots of vacancies in Manhattan and lots of owners of those properties who were lowering their prices to get owners back into those storefronts in those stores, and you've got more chain stores. The rents are started off much higher in Manhattan. In outer boroughs, people were staying where they lived and they were working. They were taking the subway and biking, and those stores were being used. There were some that were shut down temporarily, but
during the pandemic,
I live out in Queens, and people were out on the street just as much as they had been because they needed to be. So
the pressure was not on landlords to fill those spaces. Before we bring the assembly member into the dialogue, we have a map, and just to give people a picture, so you can see certain neighborhoods did okay, but certainly right there in the south central part of the Bronx, and I see the assembly members. We have a close up of the Bronx. Let's take a look at that. That looks like a nice, good, heavy part of your district, assembly member. What do you hear from storefront owners? Are they concerned about this? I would think they would be.
This is such a big concern, and it happened during COVID and after. One of the only Black-owned sports bar had to close down, the Dugout, because they could not afford the rent. The rent was in $100,000. He did not get any pandemic relief and had to close down. And the New York Times quoted that the storefront rent has increased 30% over the
30%.
30%. And so those are things that I'm hearing because people are having a hard time just to stay in business. I have a comic book store on 3rd Avenue that had to close down as well because of the issue with the rents being so high. You
mentioned the pandemic loans. I mean, and again, looking back now, the federal agency received just over 1 million loan applications for its pandemic relief program in New York State, but only 339,000, a third, were approved.
Yeah.
Why? And I've heard from store owners as well that we didn't even do well then.
No.
Why did that happen?
Not sure, but we only got 1% of those loans here in the Bronx. And that made me so upset. And we had the bids helping people out with securing the loans. But something was happening. There was a disconnect between us applying and us receiving the funds.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about it before the show. I mean, in many cases, it's largely a city council thing. And the state, obviously, you're looking in general. Is there something out there for the state to do, or is it really a case for you to do what you're doing now and just advocate for the concept?
So, I mean, this could be a state conversation, but the truth is it's been very local and it's been a city conversation. Every time I get to see the mayor, I get to talk to him about what do we do to get stores, to get the vacancy rate down when it comes to storefronts, especially in my neighborhood, because when you have vacant storefronts, that means there's loitering happening. That means there's rodents happening. There are lots of other things happening that deters the neighborhood, not having a business.
A stupid question, but I got to ask it. How important are these neighborhood storefronts and our local businesses to the local economy, and why?
Oh, it's extremely important.
Yeah, I said
it's extremely important
question.
Because a lot of people, especially during COVID, stayed very close to home. And when you are close to home and you don't have access to this things, just as a woman, having a hair supply store, those things matter to us. And when you have to travel on a train to go into Manhattan to get those things, it means a lot.
It means a lot, and it also, of course, hurts our local economies.
Absolutely.
Last question for you. We'll get back to Ms. Block. I realize it's a city issue. Are there tax breaks? Because businesses always talk about, gee, I'm paying too much in taxes. I got fined because my awning is not of code, et cetera, et cetera. Can something be done, or do you have? I'm assuming you advocate.
Yeah,
I don't do that. But is there something out from the state that we could get?
I mean, there's a few things that I've been advocating for, like the amount of times that the Department of Building comes out to people and give them fines, and just working with the fines that people have. Also incentivizing people for opening up new businesses into vacant spaces, and getting people who own spaces to actually have to do the renovation so they can open up. Just incentivizing people to do the right thing is where the state can come in and play.
And is that dialogue happening? I realize you guys have just been through a heck of a budget go-around.
To say the least.
But in your committee, is it out there?
So it's a conversation.
I know if they asked you, it would be.
It would be, right. It's not. It doesn't seem to have hit the state level as it should be. But as chair of the micro business, this is something that I talk with my mayor often about.
But you've talked with Eric Adams.
Absolutely.
Ms. Block, the Assembly member brought up the whole idea of applications for new businesses. One of the things that I was aware of was through the pandemic and as we emerge, more and more people, especially Bronx people who are unique and creative and inventive, really wanted to do entrepreneurial businesses and start their own businesses. Do landlords, do you think, use that as incentive to say, the demand is up, price goes up, and those kinds of things? Is that part of this whole network of problems?
I mean, you do see that the storefront vacancy rates are generally lower kind of the farther you get out from lower Manhattan for storefronts. And so I think, there is definitely not a perfect correlation between vacancy rates and rents. And I think that speaks to the fact that landlords have kind of complete say over what they want to set their rents at, right? And so I think that if a storefront owner believes that they can make more rent off of a space, then they're going to try to get that rent. If they see there's a lot of interest in opening up a space, possibly, but also if they see that there's an opportunity to kind of hold off and wait out for a larger chain store, if the neighborhood's changing and more chain stores are coming in, they can often get, what they see to be longer term tenants who are going to be willing to pay a higher rent over time.
I mentioned it at the top of the show that this could be another door opening for gentrification in neighborhoods where we haven't seen it. Is that a concern?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
She said in a word, yes.
You see huge rent increases from over those 2 years, from 2019 to 2021. In one district that you showed on the map, the rent increase was as much as 33%, 1/3, which is the same as what you've heard from individual store owners.
It's just so much money. It's just so much.
Absolutely. I mean, can you imagine getting a 1/3 increase on your rent for your apartment? It's you can't do it, right? So the expectation.
I want to just translate that back to the reality. So look, you run a deli, or you have a small coffee shop, or a hair supply place, and all of a sudden your rent goes up 33%, or you have a small restaurant, your rent goes up 33%, especially in some of our Bronx neighborhoods where people don't have a lot of money in their pockets. Say, well, okay, so it costs me another $10 to have breakfast or something in some places that nobody really cares. Here, that's a big thing.
Sure. I mean, if your business is paying $6,000 per month in rent and it goes up 33%, that's it's an extra $2,000 that you're paying per month, and that money has to come from somewhere.
I've had a number of conversations, and we did a forum with real estate agents, and many of them are Bronx people, and they want to do the right thing. Is there a way to just say, hey, let's look at the data we have now, and we realize you also have an interest, and kind of make an arrangement?
Well, we're not just quantifying the data that we have reported by owners, but we're hitting the pavement. ANHD has been working with local partners in 7 local partners around the city, including 2 in the Bronx. We're working with Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, as well as the Yemeni American Merchants Association. Mm-hmm. And so they are talking to merchants in these commercial corridors that are mainly people of color and immigrants and people who did not necessarily get first access to the PPP loans during the pandemic, people who run the hair salons and the beauty supply stores, and who are very connected to the local cultural fabric and understand what local needs are. And this isn't just a market rent, what can landlords get as the maximum possible for any individual space, but it's also a question of individual business owners feeling like they are completely alone if they're facing something like a 33% rent increase, and that if they don't have the revenue to pay for that it's their individual problem or the failure of their business, as opposed to that's what the owner sees that they can get, and that's not the case.
And what about, a lot of the leases go month to month. Assemblymember, you want to just talk about the whole notion of, do longer leases help? Is there a way to either incentivize that or say, look, you want a stable neighborhood? I don't know.
My daughter just became a space owner. She owns a studio, and she's month to month.
In the Bronx?
She's actually in East Harlem because she could not afford the Bronx.
Wow.
But
boy, that's the story. Here's a Bronx Assemblymember whose daughter would work in the Bronx. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, and she went to East Harlem, and she's month to month. So for young people, month to month may work because they don't have to commit as much. But my girlfriend who owned a nail salon, she was a 1-year lease, and for her, she just wanted to have a 10-year lease because she put so much work into that salon. And then when her rent went up within a matter of a year, she had to then vacate, and she had all of that construction that she did in that place
I was
just go
going to
with
say
it.
the construction
So-
and the moving and everything else.
So longer leases.
So where do we get answers? What do we do now? I mean, we'll start with you. What do we do?
Yeah. So one thing that we're doing is gathering information on the ground from these neighborhoods that we know are the cultural fabric of our city and that power our city. And we are making sure that individual merchants don't feel like they're alone with the conditions they're facing. We talked about how many storefront tenants are month to month. We talked to many who don't have any leases at all. And they really should have a structure and protections and rights that residential tenants have and storefront businesses do not.
And this would come out of the city specifically, right? It's more city legislation, although, you could nudge your assembly.
I wouldn't mind.
She would
I wouldn't put
advocate
up a
for
fight.
it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are opportunities at both the city and state level, but where we're starting is by creating a collective group of small business owners who understand that these are issues that face all of them and that they have a collective interest, because ANHD could talk to our representatives and advocate for a solution, but if we're not talking to the actual business owners and they're not on board, then it's completely going to be disconnected from the reality.
Do BIDs, business improvement districts, have a role here, and some of the other business organizations and local business advocacy groups have a role? I mean, it would seem to me they would also want to take part.
Sure. We're collaborating with some merchant associations. So I mentioned the Yemeni American Merchant Association, and that's here in the Bronx. Also,
because we have many in the Bronx. I mean, I'm thinking I don't want to call anybody out. The Kingsbridge Road Merchants Association. There's KRVC up in
161 bid.
Bronx.
And we want to
161 bid.
We want to make sure that tenants of commercial buildings have protections and rights that they deserve. And so we're really interested in having those business owners who are often tenants of the space that they're in, as opposed to owning the property. We want to make sure that they're able to communicate with one another and get some of the protections that they need.
And so for you, where do we go? What do we do?
I mean, we continuously do the local work and advocate at the city and state level. I think we have to get people to come together, which is why, I'm chair of the micro business at the state level, and I'm going to have a virtual and in-person resource fair so that we can finally start coming together and have a collective voice. The lobbyists, that normally come to see me, they advocate for the larger companies. And so we need for someone to come together and bring the smaller voices together and on the one accord.
I really see the value of that. And again, I'm going to speak for my friends in the real estate industry and the local real estate. I'm not talking about the big realtors, but I think there's a willingness there as long as they can make out. And it seems to me you can get everybody together. You have an advocacy. You have like an advocacy through ANHD. Talk about that commitment that you're making.
Yeah. So what I've been talking about is the citywide merchant organizing project that we've started in conjunction. So this is supported by Small Business Services to go out into the neighborhoods where we are losing our small businesses because of these rising rents and other pressures, and make sure that we are getting together and having people talk to one another, because when everyone's isolated from each other, nothing's going to happen in their interests. And so we need to make sure people are connected to one another and organizing together.
Let's just go through the process. I go through a Bronx neighborhood, and I go down the street and they say, look at this, 4 storefronts, are empty. If somebody sees that in the neighborhood, whether they're on the community board or they're just saying, look, this isn't good for anybody, what do you do? How do you start the process of figuring out how to get them occupied by people who have a couple of dollars?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really good question. You were talking about people who are wanting to start up new businesses. And my question is, are they connected to the people they need to be connected to? Do they know who the brokers are who are going to be able to get them into those spaces? And do they have the resources they need to negotiate a lease term that's going to work for them? So there's kind of a network of resources and people that needs to be in place in order for small business owners and people from the community to be able to set up in those spaces and access it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think most people would say they appreciate having small local businesses there and local entrepreneurs as opposed to big chain stores that they can find anywhere.
I think a lot of people feel that way. Assemblymember, let's just talk about the education piece. Do you find that people who come and say, "Hey, I want to start a business," your own daughter was involved in that. Are there enough associations to turn to? Is that the kind of thing that we could develop more of to spur development?
Well, we can definitely always encourage more, but we have our SBA and our SBS, and we have a federal, state, and city development, organizations that will help people start their business. And sometimes what happens is there's a lack of access to those businesses,
Why
or just knowing that it exists.
People don't know.
People don't know that it exists. So my office, every single year, I fund programs that teach about entrepreneurship with young people, and then I connect them to the small business associations so that they know where to go if they need grants or help with writing their business
Do
plans.
you find that it works?
It works because young people...
You actually see them go through it and then, wow, look at that.
And they produce a product or, so this is my second year actually funding a program. And my students are actually going to have a pop-up shop at Borough Hall.
Oh, that's great.
Coming up
wait,
soon.
we want to know more about that.
Yes, coming soon. And so they are going to show everyone what they've created in the 6 weeks that they had this program put in place.
Wow. About how many students? And you say it's going to be like in the
Borough
Veterans
Hall.
Memorial Hall down in
You
Borough
got
Hall?
it.
When is that? That's exciting.
So we're working,
about that.
and of course we would love to have you, Gary, or anyone from BronxNet to come out and talk to the young people and cover it. But
this
it's 12
is
young girls.
for our morning show open, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So let's remember to do that. Go ahead.
No, there are 12 girls who completed. We had 14 start off and 12 completed. 2 of the young boys didn't complete, but we're getting them back involved. It gets a little tricky, I guess.
It is tricky, and listen, we open up the door to all kinds of things. We got to get our guys doing this stuff.
Yes.
The girls are understanding it a little better. I'm a Bronx boy. I know what it's like to be a Bronx boy, and they get distracted. But we got to because when you say we have 14 girls, but 2 guys didn't complete, I want to get those guys to complete.
Same.
You want me to talk to them?
I would love for you to talk to them. You know, my dad was a businessman. That's how I actually met you. And so business is really important in my family. My mom is an immigrant from Belize, and without, having a formal education when she first got here, she had to sell things to make sure that she was able to take care of kids.
Ms. Block, what we just heard from the assembly member leads me to ask the question. Now, we have many migrants coming in.
Sure.
I had this crazy idea that because obviously it's a very big problem for the mayor and for the city and for all of us, that if we could create a community and put them all in there, they want to work, they want jobs, they're ready to go. I wish we could find a way to use this to spur on some local economy. Am I dreaming?
No, I mean, immigrants have been the backbone of New York City's economy for as long as New York City has existed. So, I don't think this is different. It takes time, and it's going to take...
The education piece that we just spoke about. If there are people who are saying we want to get started, they can contact ANHD and figure out how to do that. I want to ask you something else. But
and we would especially love to connect with local businesses who want to be involved with this organizing. And as I mentioned, we have 7 community partners. So I mentioned the 2 that are in the Bronx, but we have them in other parts of the city as well. We hope to continue and grow this work. So we are thrilled to connect with business owners who want to be participating in these conversations about how they can advocate for their rights collectively.
We got in contact with ANHD about the commercial rent piece, but we have cleverly ignored the whole housing rent piece. 8 of the Bronx's 12 community districts are listed as the highest threats for affordable housing. Of course, this relates to the commercial rents because if the people don't make enough money to pay their own rent, they're certainly not going to spend a lot of money in stores. Just briefly, since we have about a minute or two, talk a little bit about what you discovered with the rents, residential rents, and where we're at, especially in the Bronx.
Yeah. In many districts around the city, including the Bronx, you have simultaneously threats to existing affordable housing,
Right.
such as high rates of eviction filings, high rates of serious housing code violations and poor conditions, which also puts pressure on people to leave. And you simultaneously have a large number of new units coming in that are either market rate rents or quote unquote affordable rents that are being marketed to people who make at least 80% AMI, which can be easily twice as much as what the actual district median income
Right.
is. And so you have this combination of factors of pressures pushing people out who are in their housing that they currently are able to or just able to afford, somehow able to afford, and an influx of units. You also have expiring affordable units that are financed by LIHTC. So it's really like these combined trends of pressure on our deeply affordable housing that already exists and an influx of new housing, which is absolutely not affordable to people who live in those lower rent units currently.
Well said.
And it's all kind of a cycle. Unfortunately, I've been sitting in this seat for many years, and we talked about gentrification, certainly in the lower part of the southern part of the Bronx, and we're seeing it, develop right before our eyes. Ironic word to use, develop. Do you think we're in for another round in neighborhoods that hadn't been gentrified before? In other words, your study showed that Kingsbridge and Fordham were maybe mostly hardest hit. We haven't seen that kind of gentrification there. You think that's on the way?
I think it's really important to remember that gentrification and displacement are not inevitable forces that we're subject to, but they're a result of decisions that we
I
make.
appreciate that. Yeah.
So I'm sure you know that our government and elected officials are responsible for many, many policy decisions, and it's up to us as communities and advocates to make sure we're working with our elected officials on policies that keep that from happening.
And local media. Assemblymember Jackson, your final thoughts on this? Advice for community members who are concerned, for store owners who are concerned?
Yes, store owners who are concerned should definitely be reaching out to elected officials to see if they can get help with any fines that they may have, any code violations, and if you need support in how to get some grants out there, because there's a lot of grants as well.
There are grants.
And we can
I
help you
know
with
that we used to call them the BOEDC, but now I think it's the BXEDC.
BXEDC.
Is they really are working on that. That's something so you could reach right out to the borough president.
Sorry to interject. If there's one other resource I could
Yes,
mention, it's the
please.
Commercial
Don't be
Lease
sorry. We
Assistance
want it.
Program. So
What
their
program, I'm sorry?
Commercial Lease Assistance, which
Okay.
we've heard from businesses in the Bronx that they're actually accessing that program less, which is available and can help business owners negotiate a fair
that's so
lease. So that's also an important resource to connect through the small business services, which I'm sure they can also reach through their local elected officials.
Lucy Block from ANHD, keep fighting for us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Assemblymember Jackson, we had you virtually, but now in person.
Thank you for having me in the studio.
Nice to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Gary.
Folks, that will do it for us. Our our producer this evening, Stephen Powell, sat in, and we appreciated his work this evening. Nick Marrero is our director. We have a cast of thousands around us here and in the control room. They work with us in the studio, and we thank them as well. We thank you, and we will see you next week. Good night.